What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Guys That Magic. I'm going to be your host, Dave, taking you through a deck tech of Thalia and the Gitrog monster today. Thalia and the Gitrog monster is a brand new legendary creature that's going to be coming out here with March of the Machines. She costs, or I guess they cost, 1, a white, a black, and a green for a legendary creature human frog horror. It's a 4/4 with first strike and death touch and says that you may play an additional land on each of your turns. It also says creatures and non-basic lands your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped. And if that wasn't enough, it also says whenever Thalia and the Gitrog monster attacks, sacrifice a creature or land, then draw a card. So just kind of a little bit up front with this. This is a commander that does a lot of things, and it's kind of all over the place. This is truly as if they just took a Thalia and a Gitrog monster and stapled the abilities together onto one card, and it doesn't necessarily have a very clear design or direction. Now, with that being said, I have designed this deck actually from scratch a couple of times, and this is the rendition that I kind of figured worked the smoothest. I tried to dive into each one of its abilities just kind of wholeheartedly and going full force in one of those directions. So, for example, playing around with just simply a stacks build, a land matters build, or potentially even like a sacrifice matters build. And I found that they tend to work best whenever you actually play around with all three of those abilities and really use this card as a value engine. The other wonderful thing about this commander is that it does drop relatively early. It only costs 4 mana, and it is an absolute powerhouse whenever it comes to combat. Having first strike and death touch means that this is going to kill just about anything that comes into contact with it, and if you need it to, it can always sit back as an incredibly effective blocker. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the creatures that are going to help to support this. We do have a couple of mana dorks in this deck that we're going to be throwing in here to help get our commander into play as soon as possible. So we do have Avacyn's Pilgrim. This is a single green mana for a creature human monk. It's a 1/1 that you can tap to add a white to your mana pool. We have Birds of Paradise, which is a single green mana. It's a creature bird. It is a 0/1 with flying that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color. Elves of Deep Shadow is a single green mana for a creature elf druid. It is a 1/1 that you can tap to add a black to your mana pool, and it says it deals 1 damage to you. Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves are both a single green mana for elf druids that can tap for a green, and they are both 1/1s. So that's going to make up 5 of our mana dorks just to help make sure that we can get our commander into play a little bit earlier. Thalia on turn 3 is incredibly powerful. Now, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this video, we did kind of go in multiple different directions in terms of the overall design of this deck. I do think that this does kind of balance it out, however. So with that being said, we have a couple of creatures that really care about making tokens that are utilizing that land ability. So being able to play the 2 lands per turn. The first one here, and one of our haymakers, is going to be Avenger of Zendikar. This is 5 and 2 green for a creature elemental. It's a 5/5 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control. It also has landfall and says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control. Essentially, Avenger of Zendikar is just going to be a big creature that is going to give you a kind of like an instant board state, and then also reward you with Thalia and the Gitrog monster's ability for you to play additional lands each turn. Rampaging Baloths is 4 and 2 green for a total of 6 mana. It is a creature beast. It's a 6/6 with trample and landfall, and says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token. So same essential kind of strategy here as Avenger of Zendikar. We want to get these creatures into play and then start dropping those lands in to either give us some tokens or to start bumping up our team. We are going to be running Scoot Swarm in this deck. This is 2 and a green for a creature insect. It is a 1/1 with landfall and says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If you control 6 or more lands, create a token that is a copy of Scoot Swarm instead. And we also have Titania, Protector of Argoth here. This is 3 and 2 green for a legendary creature elemental. It's a 5/3, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It also says whenever a land you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, create a 5/3 green elemental creature token. Now, interesting enough on this ability, it cares about those lands going to the graveyard, but wonderfully with Thalia and the Gitrog monster, we can always choose to sacrifice one of our lands on that attack trigger, which means so long as Titania is in play, we can start pumping out some 5/3 creatures to help support the team. Now, if you haven't noticed already, we really do want to also be creating this kind of go-wide board state. One of the interesting things about this is that it kind of feeds into Thalia and the Gitrog monster's other abilities, and that it cares about being able to sacrifice things, not just lands, but also creatures too. And then also with having our opponent's creatures enter the battlefield tapped, it does give us a little bit of a leeway in that we could potentially start swinging in and our opponent won't have anything up for blocks. With that being said, we do also have a bit of a token package in this deck. So first off here, we're going to be running Adeline, Resplendent Cathar. This is 1 and 2 white for a total of 3 mana. It is a legendary creature human knight. It's a star 4 with a vigilance and says that its power is equal to the number of creatures you control. It also says whenever you attack, for each opponent, create a 1/1 white human creature token that's tapped and attacking that player or planeswalker they control. This is just a pretty nice little way for you to kind of just get extra tokens into play, and it does allow us to kind of feed into that go wide strategy. We do have 2 other cards here that are going to be highly synergistic with our commander, the first of which being World Shaper. This is 3 and a green for a creature Merfolk Shaman. It's a 3/3 and says whenever it attacks, you may mill 3 cards. It also says that whenever it dies, return all land cards from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is a really powerful ability in a deck like this because in the case you are sacrificing away so many of your lands, World Shaper will allow you to grab all of those and then put them back into play. Another creature that is going to be really important, and I'll talk a lot more about later on in the video, is Kodama of the East Tree. This is 4 and 2 green for a total of 6 mana. It is a legendary creature spirit. It is a 6/6 with reach and says whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. This card also has partner, but that's not relevant to this deck. Kodama of the East Tree generally is just going to be a wonderful value engine. If you haven't noticed already, we do have a couple of rather expensive drops in the deck to include Kodama itself. With that being said, though, it is going to allow us to be able to start cheating extra things into play, and I'm going to touch back on this card a little bit later on in the video as to why it is so important here. The next kind of creature package that we're going to be looking at is going to be maximizing our commander's ability to sacrifice things, and essentially with that, we also are going to be playing an Aristocrats package. Many of the cards that I wanted to include in here that care about lands also happen to make tokens, which is wonderful for this kind of strategy. The first card here is Blood Artist. This is 1 and a black for a creature vampire. It is a 0/1. It says whenever it or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Cruel Celebrant is a white and a black for a creature vampire. It is a 1/2 and says whenever Cruel Celebrant or another creature or planeswalker you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Ellis Ilkor, Sadistic Pilgrim, is a white and a black for a legendary creature Phyrexian Core Cleric. It is a 2/2 with Death Touch and says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and whenever another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. Zulaport Cutthroat is 1 and a black for a creature human rogue ally. It's a 1/1 and says whenever it or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Poison Tip Archer is 2, a black, and a green for a total of 4 mana. It's a 2/3 elf archer. It has reach and death touch and says whenever another creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life. The reason why I wanted to include all of these in this deck is because Thalia and the Gitrog monster does also have that sacrifice ability, allowing us to be able to get some additional benefit. Not only are we going to be drawing cards whenever we sacrifice one of our things, but so long as one of these creatures are in play, we're also going to be hurting our opponents anytime any of our things are going to die. If we happen to get more than one of these in play, the abilities do start to stack up and become very dangerous very quickly. And then it also does help to add in a little bit of kind of like a board effect prevention mode that we have here. We have a couple of token generators in the deck, so if we do start to overextend or start to go a little bit too wide, our opponents might have to double think playing a board wipe, knowing that we have some of these cards in play. To continue with the Sacrifice Matters theme, we do have Grim Horospex. This is 2 and a black for a creature human wizard. It's got Morph, and it also says whenever another non-token creature you control dies, draw a card. It is a 3/2. We also have Pitiless Plunderer. This is 3 and a black for a creature human pirate. It is a 1/4, and it says whenever another creature you control dies, create a treasure token. Morbid Opportunist is 2 and a black for a creature human rogue. It's a 1/3 and says whenever one or more other creatures die, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. And Midnight Reaper is 2 and a black for a creature zombie knight. It is a 3/2 and says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Midnight Reaper deals 1 damage to you and you draw a card. All of these creatures are going to be included in the deck because they are additional value engines. They care about our creatures dying, which is wonderful because whenever Thalia and the Gitrog monster starts swinging, we are going to have to start sacrificing something. Speaking about some things that we maybe really do want to sacrifice, we have 3 creatures in this deck. They're going to make sure we have a constant stream of cannon fodder. The first one here is Bloodghast is 2 black for a creature vampire spirit. It is a 2/1 that says it cannot block. It says it has haste as long as an opponent has 10 or less life. And the reason why the card is going to be included in the deck, the most important thing here being is it has landfall and says whenever land enters a battlefield under your control, you may return Bloodghast from your graveyard to the battlefield. Really synergizes very well whenever it comes to Thalia. Not only can we sacrifice this away to draw a card on its attack ability, but we can also then use Thalia with those additional land drops to make sure that we get Bloodghast back into play. That way we have that continuous stream of cannon fodder. Reassembling Skeleton is 1 and a black for a creature skeleton warrior. It's a 1/1 and has the ability allowing you to pay 1 and a black to return Reassembling Skeleton from the graveyard back to the battlefield tapped. Once again, this is really just going to be providing that constant stream of cannon fodder. That way we can keep swinging in with Thalia and not worry about actually destroying any of our board state. Jadar Coolcaller of Thalia is 1 and a black for a legendary creature, human wizard. It's a 1/1 and it says at the beginning of your end step, if you control no creatures with Decayed, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. Now you're not going to want to sacrifice Jadar, but the constant stream of zombies, once again, just allowing us to make sure that we always have a creature in play that we don't really care about if it goes to the grave. 2 creatures in this deck that really synergize very well whenever it comes to Thalia and the Gitrog monster. The first of which being Audric Lunarch Marshal. This is 3 and a white for a legendary creature human soldier. It's a 3/3 and says at the beginning of each combat, creatures you control gain first strike until end of turn if a creature you control has first strike. The same is true for flying, death touch, double strike, haste, hexproof, indestructible, lifelink, menace, reach, skulk, trample, and vigilance. The reason why this is so incredibly powerful in a deck like this is because our commander has first strike and death touch, meaning it is an absolute beast to deal with in combat. A huge annoyance for our opponents as well. Being able to give all of our creatures first strike and death touch so long as our commander remains in play is such a powerful ability and is really going to make sure that we pad up and protect our life total. Nobody's going to want to be swinging in if all of our creatures have those 2 keywords. The second one here being Ulvenwald Tracker. This is a single green mana for a creature human shaman. It's a 1/1 with the ability of you can pay 1 and a green and tap it to have target creature you control fight another target creature. With Thalia and the Gitrog monster having those 2 keywords, it means that any creature that they would fight, assuming that that creature doesn't have first strike or double strike too, would just basically immediately die. The other creature is not going to get the opportunity to do. If you haven't picked up on it already, this deck is a little bit odd in that it doesn't necessarily pick a specific lane, but kind of tries to play just general mid-range good stuff while using the commander to be able to make sure that you're constantly drawing cards and beating your opponents to death. With that being said, pretty much the rest of our creatures are going to be acting more so as a support package here and just kind of helping to smooth out a couple of areas that I thought were really important. The first card that I'm going to talk about is Dark Confidant. This is 1 and a black for a creature human wizard. It is a 2/1 and says at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library and put that card into your hand. You lose life equal to its converted mana cost. We do have a couple of expensive creatures in this deck. However, from playtesting, I have noticed that Dark Confidant, for the most part, doesn't really hurt you all that bad. And in the case that you do start to lower your life total and you don't feel comfortable with Dark Confidant in play, you can always sacrifice him to Thalia and the Gitrog's sacrifice ability. Eternal Witness is 1 and 2 green for a creature human shaman. It is a 2/1, and it says whenever ETBs, you can return target card from your graveyard to your hand. King Darien 48 is 1 a green and a white for a legendary creature human soldier. It is a 2/3 and says other creatures you control get +1/+1. It also has an ability where you can pay 3 a green and a white to put a +1/+1 counter on King Darien and create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. And then lastly, you can sacrifice him to have creature tokens you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Generally speaking, he just synergizes very well with the tokens that we'll be producing in this deck. Mentor of the Meek is up next. This is 2 and a white for a creature human soldier. It is a 2/2 and says whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1. If you do, draw a card. Sun Titan is 4 and 2 white for a creature giant. It's a 6/6 with vigilance and says whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with mana value of 3 or less from your graveyard to your battlefield. This does really well in being able to recur maybe some of the smaller creatures that you sacrificed to Thalia earlier on, or be able to make sure that you're grabbing those lands back from your graveyard. Also included here, we have Varagoth, Bloodsky Sire. This is 2 and a black for a legendary creature demon rogue. It's a 2/3 with Death Touch, and it's got an ability with Boast where you can pay 1 and a black. And it says target player searches their library for a card, then shuffles their library and puts that card on top of it. I love having this creature in the deck because not only is it decent whenever it comes to dealing damage, nobody's really wanting to block a creature with Death Touch, but in the case we do manage to get through, we can always pay that ability and then also start to tutor up with it. Tireless Provisioner is 2 and a green for a creature elf scout. It is a 3/2 with landfall and says whenever land enters battlefield under your control, create a food token or a treasure token. I love this card, and I especially love it in a deck where I'm potentially playing 2 or more lands per turn. So Tireless Provisioner does a wonderful job of being able to make sure that we have those tokens in play, and 9 times out of 10, I'm probably going to be making treasures, so we're going to be ramping here as well. Ramanov Excavator is 2 and a green for a creature Naga Cleric. It is a 2/3, and it says you may play land cards from your graveyard. We haven't really gotten into it so much yet, but you will also start to notice there is a bit of a recursion theme in this deck, whether it be for recursion creatures or being able to grab those lands that we may have sacrificed earlier on. Ramanov Excavator is one of the creatures that allows us to be able to do so. Going into some of the instants and sorceries that are going to help to support this list, the first 2 cards we're going to talk about are going to be able to help us ramp out and potentially get Thalia and the Gitrog monster in play a little earlier. The first one here is Nature's Lore. This is 1 and a green for a sorcery. It says search your library for a forest card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. And 3 Visits is 1 and a green for a sorcery, saying search your library for a forest card, put the card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. To continue on with our instants and sorceries, let's talk a little bit about our dedicated removal package. The first card here is Swords of Plowshares. It's a single white mana that says exile target creature, its controller gains life equal to its power. Path to Exile is a single white mana for an instant that says exile target creature, its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. These are probably the 2 best creature removal spells in the entire format. Being in Abzan, we have access to some incredibly powerful removal spells, so we're also going to be throwing in Assassin's Trophy. This is a black and a green for an instant that says destroy target permanent and opponent controls. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. We're also going to be throwing Generous Gift in here. This is 2 and a white for an instant. It says destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. And Anguished Unmaking, which is 1 a white and a black for an instant that says exile target non-land permanent, you lose 3 life. I love the ability for you to just hit almost anything with all 3 of these cards, so all 3 of them I definitely feel warrant their spot on the deck. We do have 2 board wipes in this list, the first of which being Wrath of God. This is 2 and 2 white for a sorcery that says destroy all creatures, they can't be regenerated. We've also got Farewell, which is 4 and 2 white. It's a sorcery that says choose 1 or more. Exile all artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, exile all graveyards. So very flexible, and the exile effect there can be incredibly impactful as well. Just do keep in mind you're going to be exiling away all of your things that you just named as well. So this can potentially hurt you later on down the road. We have a single sorcery in this list that is meant for mass recursion, and this is Eerie Ultimatum. It is 2 white, 3 black, 2 green for a total of 7 mana. It's a sorcery that says return any number of permanent cards with different names from your graveyard to the battlefield. Since we are playing a game of Commander, all of your permanents, with the exception of basic lands, should have different names. So this will grab everything in your graveyard and dump it directly back into play. Eerie Ultimatum is a card that whenever it does get cast, almost always makes a massive swing for the game, and chances are you're probably going to win on the back of this card if your opponents cannot pull out a board wipe. As far as the artifacts go for this list, we do have a couple in here that are going to help to smooth out our mana base. We have Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, Soul Ring, Talisman of Hierarchy, Talisman of Resilience, and Talisman of Unity. Because these things see so much play, I'm actually not going to read them all on their own. If you haven't watched any of the videos that I put up here on this channel so far, I absolutely love the talismans. Those are my favorite 2 mana rocks to play with. So I am going to include all 3 for this color combination. For some additional card draw, and because we do have a commander that can sacrifice things, we're also going to be throwing a Skull Clamp into this list. Skull Clamp is a single mana for an artifact equipment. It says the equipped creature gets +1/-1, and whenever the equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards. It's got an equip cost of just 1. If we are going to be sacrificing the creature to Thalia as well, just keep in mind you're actually going to be drawing 3 cards off that. So 2 for the Skull Clamp and then 1 for her ability. It's a really powerful card draw in a deck like this. We also have 2 other artifacts that are really important to this list, the first of which being Conduit of Worlds. This is 2 and 2 green for an artifact that says you may play land cards from your graveyard. It also says you can tap it and choose target non-land permanent card in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that spell, and if you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. This is a really powerful card because it allows us to make use of all of those lands we put in the graveyard, while also potentially giving us a second ability that in the case we have nothing else going on, we can at least kind of use that as card advantage. Next up here, we also have Crucible of Worlds. This is 3 mana for an artifact that says you may play land cards from your graveyard, just to kind of to function as an additional copy. If anything, actually, Conduit of Worlds would be functioning as the additional copy, but I guess it does have that slight upside. As far as some of the enchantments in this deck, we do have a couple that care about lands entering the battlefield, or that just generally kind of help make us a couple of tokens, help to extend our board state. The first one here that we're going to talk about is Retreat to Emeria. Retreat to Emeria is 3 and a white for a total of 4 mana. Retreat to Emeria has Landfall. That Landfall ability says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may choose 1. The first ability says, create a 1/1 white core ally creature token, and the second says, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So essentially just whichever of those 2 modes is going to be more relevant is going to be the one that you're going to choose. Very similarly, we are also running Felidar Retreat in this list. This is 3 and a white for an enchantment with Landfall and says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose 1. Create a 2/2 white cat beast creature token or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance until end of turn. These 2 enchantments do function somewhat similarly, but pretty obviously Felidar Retreat is the more powerful of the 2. Bastion of Remembrance is 2 and a black for an enchantment that says whenever it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. It also says whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Although this doesn't necessarily really make you tokens, aside from the 1 that it'll ETB with, it does kind of serve as an additional copy of one of our draining creatures that we talked about earlier. The next 4 enchantments that we're going to talk about are just generally powerhouses on their own, and they're going to help us out in different ways. The first of which being Aura Shards. This is 1 a green and a white for a total of 3 mana. It's an enchantment that says whenever a creature comes into play under your control, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. Really making use of the fact that we have a couple of recursive abilities. We have plenty of creatures in this list, and then we also have those tokens there as well. So just kind of helping to make sure that we're blowing up our opponent's enchantments or their mana rocks or anything else that they have that's just kind of sitting over there artifact or enchantment wise, making sure that we kind of slow them down a little bit more. Cathar's Crusade is 3 and 2 white for an enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. With our token enablers, this can get out of hand really quickly. Guardian Project is 3 and a green for a total of 4 mana. It's an enchantment that says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. Guardian Project is going to essentially be able to just draw us cards whenever we're not creating token creatures. So any actual creature that comes into play under our control, Guardian Project is going to help us out with a little bit of card draw there. And then lastly, I do try to keep all of these decks at around the same budget for the deck tech, typically around the $350 mark. And as of the time of this recording, we had enough money for us to fit in a Smothering Tithe here as well. This is 3 and a white for an enchantment. It says whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure token. We have 4 Planeswalkers that are included in this list as well. Each of these are going to be really, really important and could potentially actually swing a game on their own. The first one here is Elspeth, Sun's Champion. She is 4 and 2 white for a total of 6 mana. She enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty, and she has 3 abilities on her. The first ability is a +1 that says put 3 1/1 white soldier creature tokens onto the battlefield. The second ability is a -3 that says destroy all creatures with power 4 or greater. Lastly, she's got an ult at -7. It says you get an emblem with creatures you control, get +2/+2, and have flying. All 3 of her abilities are incredibly impactful on this list. She produces tokens that we can then use to sacrifice away or just to extend our overall board presence with. She's got a board wipe in the case that we absolutely need it. Do keep in mind that board wipe will kill our commander. And then lastly, she's got that ultimate in there, which is going to make all of our creatures just so much more difficult to deal with. Next up here, we have Gitrog, Cursed Huntsman. This is 4, a black, and a green for a total of 6 mana. He enters the battlefield with 5 loyalty and has 3 abilities. His first ability costs 0, and it says create 2/2 black and green wolf creature tokens. They have, when this creature dies, put a loyalty counter on each Gitrog you control. Now, sadly, this is the only Gitrog in the deck, so they're only ever going to add loyalty to this Planeswalker, but those wolves make for great sacrifice fuel for our commander, just because we can always sacrifice them away to not only draw a card, but also beef up one of our Planeswalkers in the process. His -3 says destroy target creature, draw a card, and then he's got a -6 that says you get an emblem with creatures you control, get +3/+3, and have trample. So kind of similar effect there is what we talked about with Elspeth. If we do manage to ult this, it makes our creatures very difficult to deal with. We have Lolth, Spider Queen. This is 3 and 2 black. She enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters on her, and she says whenever a creature you control dies, put a loyalty counter on Lolth, Spider Queen. Her first ability is also a 0, and this says you draw a card and lose 1 life. She's got a -3 that says create 2/1 black spider creature tokens with menace and reach. And then lastly, she's got a -8 that says you get an emblem with whenever an opponent is dealt combat damage by 1 or more creatures you control. If that player lost less than 8 life this turn, they lose life equal to the difference. Are kind of the same feel as these other Planeswalkers. She helps to come up the board. She's got additional utility in there as well with the card draw. And then lastly, if in the case that we do manage to ult her, our opponents do have to keep in mind that at that point, even if we're swinging in with just like a mana dork, it does have the potential to deal significantly more damage than it otherwise would. The other thing here about Lolth, Spider Queen, is that with us being able to gum up the board and then also potentially sacrificing things away, she does a wonderful job of protecting herself. Her loyalty is always going to be climbing because things are always going to be dying. The final Planeswalker we're going to include here is Tevish Szat, Doom of Fools. This is 4 and a black for a legendary Planeswalker spot. He enters the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters. His first ability is a +2, where you create 2/0/1 black soul creature tokens. He's also got a +1, in which you may sacrifice another creature or Planeswalker. If you do, you draw 2 cards, then draw another card if the sacrifice permanent was a commander. Probably never want to do that one. And then lastly, it's got a -10 of gain control of all commanders. Put all commanders from the command zone onto the battlefield under your control. So you'll just be able to outright steal your opponent's things with this. Moving over into the land package, we have 3 lands that are going to be helping us out, primarily just with a utility package. The first of which being Bojuka Bog. It is a land that enters the battlefield tapped, and whenever it does, it exiles all cards from target player's graveyard. Later on, you can tap it for a black mana. Castle Ardenvale is a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a plains. You can also tap it for a white mana, or you can pay 2 and 2 white for a total of 4 and tap this to create a 1/1 white human creature token. Not at exactly the best rate, but in the case you do happen to have nothing going on, maybe for example, for whatever reason, you don't have a hand anymore, this will allow you to get back into the game by creating some of those tokens, and then hopefully you can start sacrificing those away with Thalia to start drawing some cards. The last card that I wanted to talk about here was Flagstones of Torkir. This is a legendary land. It can tap for a white mana. It also says whenever it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may search your library for a plains card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Flagstones provides kind of an interesting degree of utility in a list like this, and the reason why is because we can sacrifice Flagstones to Thalia and the Gitrog monster's ability, be able to grab a plains from our deck, putting that plains directly into play, and then With any of our cards that allow us to recur lands, we can always bring back flagstones. So it's really kind of a nice synergy here. This next group of lands that we're going to be including in here is really just going to make sure that we are hitting the colors that we need to make this deck really hum and operate. The first one here is Bountiful Promenade. This is one of the bond lands that says it comes into the battlefield tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents. We're also going to be running Shattered Sanctum, Overgrown Farmland, and Deathcap Glade. These are the newer Innistrad lands. I'm not entirely sure actually if these have a nickname or not yet. But the way that they work is they enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands. Shattered Sanctum taps for either a white or a black. Overgrown Farmland taps for either a green or a white. And Deathcap Glade taps for either a green or a black. We're going to be running all 3 of the pathways that we can include in these colors. So that being Branch Loft Pathway, Bright Climb Pathway, and Dark Boar Pathway. The way that these lands work is you'll choose either the front or the back half, and then you'll be able to put them into play. They'll tap for whichever respective color of mana you chose, but with Thalia and the Gitrog monster in play, if you maybe later on need a course correct, you can always sacrifice the pathway and then potentially recur it for the other side. So a nice little way for you to kind of play around with those pathways in a list like this. We're going to also be running all 3 of the Pain lands in these colors, that being Brushland, Caves of Koilos, and Llanowar Elves. Each of these can tap for a colorless mana, or each of them can tap for one of 2 different colors of mana, but if they do, they'll deal 1 damage to you. I've noticed with these, they typically don't hurt you anywhere near as much as what you probably would think are on your just kind of like initial glance with these, and all 3 of these cards, relatively cheap right now. Of course, we're going to be playing Command Tower and Exotic Orchard. Both of these lands are pretty much just going to be auto-includes in any deck that is not mono-colored. And then we do have one fetch-esque land that's going to be included in this list, and that being Fabled Passage. It's a land that you can tap and sacrifice to search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. It says then, if you control 4 or more lands, untap that land. So Fabled Passage, really powerful in a deck where you can start recurring some of your lands because it gives us access to a repeatable fetch. With that being said, however, we are actually not running a ton of basics, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. We are going to be running 2 shock lands in this list. We're going to be running both Godless Shrine and Temple Garden. Godless Shrine can tap for either a white or a black, and Temple Garden can tap for either a green or a white. Now, the reason why I wanted to include 2 shock lands here, and these 2 specifically, is because we talked about Flagstones of Charcare earlier on, and both of these have a Plains type, which means they are legal targets in the case that Flagstones goes to the grave. Similarly, we are going to be running the Triome for this color, and that is Indatha Triome. That's a land that is a plains, swamp, and forest. You can tap for either a white, a black, or a green. It says it enters the battlefield tapped, and then it's got cycling of 3 mana, so that in case you don't want it, you can always cycle it away. We're also going to be running all 3 of the check lands for this color combination, that being Isolated Chapel, Sunpetal Grove, and Woodland Cemetery. Each of these say that they enter the battlefield tapped unless you control one of the 2 lands that they care about. So Woodland Cemetery, either a swamp or a forest, Sunpetal Grove, either a forest or a plains, and Isolated Chapel, either a plains or a swamp. And then also we are going to be running 2 of the bounce lands in this list. And I know what you're probably thinking. If you've watched any of these deck techs, you know that I hate these unless there is a really good reason why you should be running them. So we're going to be including Golgari Rot Farm and Selesnya Sanctuary. The way that these lands work is they enter the battlefield tapped, and they also say whenever they enter the battlefield, you return a land you control to its owner's hand. Selesnya Sanctuary taps for both a green and a white. So whenever you tap it, you'll add 2 mana to your mana pool. And then Golgari Rot Farm taps for both a green and a black. So same thing, you'll be tapping this for 2 mana whenever you do so. Now, I told you that I don't like to include these cards unless I have a very good reason. We're going to talk about the basic lands that I've thrown in, and then we're going to jump back to these cards, and we'll talk about some of the underlying synergies that they have. As far as the basic lands included in this list, we are going to be running 3 basic plains, 2 basic swamps, and 6 basic forests. So that is going to wrap up our mana base. Before we wrap up this deck tech though, it is really important that I do cover something with this list. All of the creatures and all of the lands in here I felt did a wonderful job of just kind of synergizing on their own. And there is actually kind of a built-in combo with this list as well. So just something to kind of keep in mind. So the way that this is going to work here is with Kodama of the East Tree in play, and with a token producer that cares about that landfall ability, we're going to be able to play one of the bounce lands. When we play a bounce land, it's going to trigger Kodama, allowing us to put another permanent with equal or lesser mana value from our hand onto the battlefield. We're also going to have to bounce one of our lands. We're going to choose to bounce the bounce land itself. This is going to create a landfall trigger, allowing us to create a token. With that bounced land going back to our hand, we're then going to be able to put it back into play because of the token that we just produced. It's a little bit weird, but say for example, we have Retreat to Emeria and Selesnya Sanctuary that we're wanting to play around with. The way that this would work is that Kodama of the East Tree in play sees Selesnya Sanctuary into the battlefield. It then will check off and will say that we can put another permanent with equal or lesser mana value from our hand onto the battlefield. Selesnya Sanctuary will also state that we need to be able to bounce a land from our battlefield back to our hand. Retreat to Emeria will check and we'll see that we have a landfall trigger, allowing us to create either that 1/1 white core ally or give creatures we control +1/+1 until end of turn. You're going to want to choose the first mode there to create the 1/1 token. Now, with the Selesnya Sanctuary trigger, you're going to actually bounce itself back to your hand. Kodama of the East Tree will see a trigger go on the stack for the 1/1 token that you just created with Retreat to Emeria. This is going to give you a couple of triggers with Kodama of the East Tree, allowing you to be able to put Selesnya Sanctuary back onto the battlefield. You're going to be able to loop this indefinitely, allowing you to create an unlimited number of tokens. Retreat to Emeria, Felidar Retreat, and Scoot Swarm all make creature tokens, which will allow you to make an infinite number of creatures. And then Tireless Provisioner allows you to make either food tokens or treasure tokens. Essentially, if you wanted to, I guess you can make an infinite number of food tokens, but I would much rather have that infinite amount of treasure tokens for whatever you want to be doing with all of that mana later on in the game. So do keep in mind, all of these cards are really powerful in their own right, but there is kind of a hidden synergy and also potential combo payoff for you with these as well. All right, if you stuck through it throughout the entire deck tech here, thank you so much. I know that this deck is most certainly a lot. It's a lot more complicated whenever you just look at it on paper than what I wanted it to originally kind of come out to. But after making this deck and actually starting from scratch multiple times, this is my 5th rendition where I've kind of completely scrapped the original build. I did feel like this actually worked by far the best. All of the different synergies and styles for this deck do have a tendency to pop off anytime that I play tested with it. So it is currently in a spot that I really enjoy. The deck at current is going for about $360, and generally this is just kind of going to be a good stuff deck. It does have a combo in it, but you're not really ever going to be pushing for that combo. So with that being said, I'd still put this at around a 6 in terms of general power level. I can see this also contending at a table with a couple of like 7s as well, so somewhere within that range. If you have enjoyed this deck tech and you would like to see more content like this, do me a huge favor. Number 1, subscribe to the channel, but also make sure that you leave a comment down below letting us know any kind of feedback you have for us. Thalia and the Gitrog monster, like I've already mentioned, is incredibly wide open, so how would you have built this deck? And then make sure that you like this as well. Don't forget to like us on our other social media platforms as well, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. We are at Guys That Magic. And then lastly, if you haven't done so already, make sure that you check out down below. We do have the Mox Field link loaded up for this deck. Until next time, this has been Guys at Magic. Peace.